Okay, hello everyone. We welcome you to this technical consultation hosted by Agora in collaboration with the International Network for People Who Use Drugs and Students for Sensible Drug Policy. Our work is centered in policy innovations that promote social justice and sustainable development. Today, we're addressing one of the most pressing challenges in the current situation in the US and in many countries, mainly in the West, I would say, which is the transition from botanical production and stability to a toxic synthetic drug supply. Let me put it that way. And we have two specialists today, experts in the topic, Dr. Ben, who will ground us in the long-term history of the opiate crisis. I'm not gonna read his whole biography. He can introduce himself too. And Dr. Jade Boyd from the British Columbia Center on Substance Use. She will be sharing evidence on how communities are currently managing risk through route switching, specifically focusing on the use of heroin in this case, right? Okay. Ben, do you want to begin?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for that really nice introduction. I always feel very daunted and humbled when I'm around practitioners because I'm a historian, and so I'm very good at looking backwards, and I'm less capable at both reading the present moment and thinking ahead. So it's really nice when I'm able to do that. So think of this as framing. I'm ill-equipped to talk about clinical questions or issues of pharmacokinetics or to think about regulatory pathways, but I do think I can offer a little bit of context on some of the questions that your work brings up. Much of this is drawn. I'm a historian of global economics of commodities, and a lot of this is drawn from my book that's out very soon, in a week or two, which you see here is Markets of Pain, Opium Capitalism, and the Global History of Painkillers. And I'm hoping that I can draw on just a couple of, maybe offer a periodization, since that's what historians do very well, to try to deepen and complicate some of the really important clinical and policy facing work that we're going to put on the table today. To start with just a very simple and maybe tried observation, when we talk about opium gum, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that this was for most of the 19th and 20th century really the foundation of the global pharmaceutical economy. This material, an agricultural material. When you look from the early 19th century onward, opium is the single most important substance in the Western apothecary. It's the first line treatment, of course, for pain, but also many other conditions, cough, diarrhea, insomnia, used for basically everything. In the United States throughout the 19th century, and really actually in the beginning in the late 18th, physicians and druggists dispensed hundreds of thousands of pounds of it every year, most of that in the United States. Came from the Ottoman Empire, from Turkey, from Anatolia. And in the countries that produce that opium, and mostly we're talking here about India and Turkey, hundreds of thousands of farming families sustain their livelihoods by scoring poppy capsules and scraping dried gum, which is a process that you can see many parts of the world. I've seen it in India and in Turkey, but of course, Central America and South America. You can see this in many different contexts to Mexico and Colombia primarily. So the story of how we got from this world to the world of synthetic opioids, mostly fentanyl, mass overdose death, and a drug supply that is so toxic that it requires adaptation for survival. I don't want us to read as the kind of story from a crude plant to a refined chemical and then synthetic substitutes, even though there is truth to that story. I like looking at the political choices that are made, the imperial and then post-colonial conversations around pharmaceuticals, and then the commercial imperatives that at each stage, I think, narrowed the range of substances and the modes of consumption available for people in pain. And so that story, I think of as having three chapters that I want to put on the table for our conversation today. So the first, and this locates us in the 19th century, but takes us to the middle of the 20th, is the chapter of technical isolation and substitution. So beginning with the isolation of morphine in 1817, and then accelerating throughout the 19th century, chemists broke down opium into its constituent alkaloids and then began modifying those alkaloids in different ways to create new compounds. And we know these compounds. Heroin, synthesized in 1874 and then marketed by Bayer, is the first semi-synthetic opioid. And then by the interwar years, there's a parade of further synthetics and semi-synthetics that followed. So we have oxymorphone, oxycodone, hydrocodone. Each one promises to be more effective and less addictive than its predecessor. And every one of those generally succeeded on the former and failed on the latter count. Maybe a high water moment that we can put out here is
Du coup,
1959 when.
il y a quelque chose que
So,
tu as chez moi sur le
oh no,
téléphone,
there's a
comme
sound
ça,
here.
vas-y.
Let me just mute this quickly. Maybe that, yeah. Um, So by 1959, we have the synthesis of fentanyl, which is billed as 100 times more potent than morphine. And the dream in all of this, which is stated explicitly by American policymakers in international forums like this one, from the 1920s to the 1970s, is to produce a fully synthetic substitute with the aim of severing the world's dependence on the poppy altogether. This is Herman Metz, who you see on the slide here, who in the 1920s dangled out one of the biggest industrial prizes at the time, which was $100,000, so around $2 million at the time, to the first chemist who could synthesize a fully synthetic poppy equivalent, and no one collected on that promise. So the second chapter that I want to move us through is this dismantling of a global agricultural infrastructure that worked very imperfectly and with, I think, great human cost in the 20th century to stabilize the illicit pharmaceutical opioid trade. That worked, and I put worked in scare quotes here, but that functioned from the post-war years to the 1970s. And by the 1970s, though, American policymakers who were emboldened by the early promise of synthetics pressured Turkey, they'll look to India as well, to ban poppy cultivation, pushed India to convert from a very labor-intensive scraping of gum to mechanized poppy straw processing, which it never quite fully did. And so then new production centers beginning in the 80s and then really picking up in the 90s in Tasmania captured more of the world market. And so the peasant cultivators who had once been really central to a global pharmaceutical supply increasingly became irrelevant or proffered their wares to other markets, even as the compounds derived from the plants that they produced remained medically indispensable. So first in Turkey and then in India, the state-run systems that had, at their peaks, licensed hundreds of thousands of farming families contracted really dramatically. The licit infrastructure that had maintained some relationship between agricultural labor and state oversight and pharmaceutical production really fell apart beginning in the 80s and the 90s, very slowly and unevenly, and then with consequences that I think are only now becoming visible and tied very much to end user impacts as well. So I want to talk about that connection a little bit more later. Instead, I think the third chapter is one that we're living through. And this photo in the background is from a licensed poppy farm in North India that I took a few years ago. The infrastructure that once stabilized that global trade in illicit opium collapsed right at the moment when demand for opioids was surging in the late 20th century, driven in large measure by the aggressive marketing of synthetic opioids. And we know this story. When that legal supply was tightened, users turned to heroin. When heroin became adulterated and displaced by fentanyl, the result was the toxic drug supply that this panel has worked on and worked to confound. And I think this was somewhat less aberrant than is sometimes known or realized. I think it was really the wreckage of a global system of production that had governed the world's relationship to pain and its management for well over a century. So to connect that arc and these kind of three movements to the whole plant approach that I've seen come up in this panel, I want to be both kind of supportive as a historian and also cautious. I think there's something very correct in observing that the progressive isolation of alkaloids and the drive towards synthetic substitutes has moved the world further and further away from the plant itself, and that movement has had very severe consequences for end users. And I think folks are right to say that this history is shaped by very particular interests. That's imperial science, United States diplomatic pressure, the commercial imperatives of pharmaceutical companies that stood to profit from patentable synthetics rather than an agricultural commodity that essentially anyone can grow. I would also complicate that, though, by saying that the category of medicinal opium, which some of your work brings up, and has been enshrined in the 1961 Single Convention, was also the product of about a century of political negotiation and wasn't a neutral scientific designation. In 19th century India, the British had this phrase quasi-medical use that described the millions of Indians who used excise opium for an all-purpose household remedy for pain, for calming infants. Opium was incorporated into, yes, Ayurveda and yes, Muslim Unani healing. And these are practices that refuse really neat categorization as either traditional or modern. When you look back on materials from the late 19th century, like the Royal Commission on Opium, you get a lot of fierce argument about what this particular role of medical, paramedical use is here too. And I think that none of these debates were really resolved cleanly. They were resolved by political compromise, and we can point to many other uses. I'm thinking mostly across Asia Major and Asia Minor, where a broad range of uses are winnowed down into something that I think is quite a bit less dynamic. So I don't want to discredit the invocation of traditional knowledge in our discussion today, but I also want to historicize it and to think that we can be a little more kind of careful and not less curious about, maybe not less interested in how we deploy that category in our contemporary policy conversation. And so finally, I also want to notice that the structural position of cultivators, which Jorge, you've talked about with your colleague in the Mexican context, this is a very old story too. Indian peasants in the 19th century scraped gum by hand. They delivered it to a state bureaucracy that paid them too little, even as that gum was transformed into the morphine and codeine that stocked pharmacies throughout the world. The gentleman in this picture is one of my informants in northern India, holding his contemporary opium growing license. Which is a really interesting document I can talk about more later if you'd like. Turkish cultivators sustained a trade that enriched brokers and importers, even as they remained bound in cycles of debt. The Mexican poppy farmers described in the safe supply literature squeezed between criminal organization, prohibitionist enforcement, watching the price of their crops collapse. They occupy a structural position that I think is really familiar for historians, at least. And I think what's new in this work is the insistence that producers be included not just as kind of subjects of prohibition, but also potential participants in some form of regulated future here. So, historians are never very good at offering blueprints, but I do think that we are good at problematizing some of the categories that we've inherited. And I think of those as medicinal versus non-medicinal, traditional versus modern, botanical versus synthetic. And I think they're not quite stable enough to build policy on without some kind of interrogation. So I think there are really strong reasons for us to reopen some of the definitions that we're using, and we can do that with very strong awareness of the history that produced them. So I'm going to leave it there and turn it over to folks who are practicing and in this conversation in different ways, and cede the rest of my time with thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your contribution. I already have a few questions, but I wanted to allow Dr. Boyce to continue with her presentation, and then we can think of a Q&A.
Okay, let me try to share my screen.
Do it, please, Dr. Boyce. I can also do it, though, but it would be better for you to manage the PowerPoint.
Yeah, just 1 minute. Okay, I'm just gonna bear with me. I'm getting there.
No worries. We don't see them yet.
Yeah, okay. Now I'm just gonna put it into view. Where's view? Slideshow. How's that? Can you see slides?
The slide, yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. So thanks so much for having me today, I guess. And I was asked to speak on some of my work and some of my colleagues' work doing qualitative research in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, documenting some of the recent trends in transitions from injecting to smoking unregulated drugs, primarily opioids, and their health impacts. And as I was kind of preparing this talk, I realized I've done several qualitative research studies on this topic, and I couldn't really just stick to one. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a broad idea of some of the summary from the findings. And my work in particular focuses on community-based research, community-focused policy, and kind of the value of centering the expertise of people with living experience of substance use, basically to help us better create innovative harm reduction health policy and practice. And some of the research I'm talking about today, I was hoping to present with my colleague, Matt Bond from the Canadian Association of AIDS Society and previously the Canadian Association of People Who Use Drugs, but he couldn't be here today, but I just thought I'd mention him because he's one of the lead authors and researchers in some of the work that we're doing in relation to transitioning to smoking. And I would say one of the benefits of working collaboratively with community members is that often their innovation for supporting one another in relation to addressing health harms moves a lot faster than policy, institutions, and also research evaluations. And so I included some images from the work just to kind of give you a sense of that idea. So in 2016, a public health emergency 10 years ago was declared in Vancouver, BC, because of rapidly increasing overdose deaths, primarily from opioids adulterated with fentanyl and its analogs. And we didn't have a lot of harm reduction supports at that time, even though we do live in a setting with one of the most comprehensive combination of harm reduction practices happening in Canada. So this is just a picture outside of a community center, the meth lounge chair, just kind of indicating that there isn't a space to consume smokable drugs where people can be supervised by someone who is prepared to help someone if they experience an overdose. So just a little symbol of speaking to the lack of harm reduction supports in the community. 10 years ago, when the public health emergency was declared in Vancouver, BC, the drug using community was already working really quickly to support one another and illegally erected a smoking tent and some injection sites. So this is an image of one of those smoking tents. So it wasn't sanctioned federally or by the province. Later, it did become supported by the local health authority. But This tent actually doesn't exist any longer in our setting. But just to give you an idea of what it looked like and some of the grassroots organizing that we're starting before it really became acknowledged by the broader public and health institutions. So as I kind of mentioned, all of you have also mentioned that we're experiencing a pretty intense drug crisis in Canada and also in the United States. In Canada, we've had over 50,000 deaths, overdose related, since the public health emergency 10 years ago. It's been 10 years, and we've had a bunch of different harm reduction implementations, but the deaths can continue to rise, a little bit lower in 2025, but still increasing. And really, it's the leading cause of death in British Columbia between ages 19 to 59. And as I mentioned, primarily driven by illicit fentanyl and its analogs, but we're seeing from drug checking that we have a lot of different adulterants now in the drug supply, like benzodiazepines, tranquilizers, things like that, that are causing, quick and heavy sedation that is also increasing the risk of overdose and also gender-based violence as well. And I'll say it's not only driven by fentanyl, but of course, prohibitionist drug policies, which create the conditions for unregulated markets and kind of the impetus for higher drug potency. So that's just an image in the alley, kind of outside of an overdose prevention site in Vancouver. So since 2012, but also from 2016, there has been a very notable shift in the route of consumption for substances. Many people initially were injection drug users, and now we have a higher number of people smoking unregulated opioids, and a lot of people who are doing both, or doing a range of things. There might also be swallowing, or we have fentanyl patches as well. But the increase has been quite steady, especially from 2016 to our present date, even though most of our overdose prevention sites, for example, and other supports really mostly only support things like injecting. So it's basically the leading mode of consumption in fatal unregulated overdoses right now in British Columbia in particular. So you can see the stat there that we had 65% of overdose deaths in 2025 were related to smoking, whereas only 9% were related to injecting opioids. And as you can see there, 69% of people tested in relation to toxicity had fentanyl within the drugs, and also other things, like I mentioned, cocaine, methamphetamine, et cetera. Tranquilizers are a little bit more common in drug adulteration in the East Coast. In British Columbia, we have more benzodiazepines right now, along with fentanyl in the drug supply. I'll get into that a little bit because just to tell you where some of this data is coming from, we did several studies, as I mentioned, looking at some of the gaps in harm reduction around smoking because so many people are smoking their drugs. And so one study I'm drawing from was with 31 interviews with people who use drugs in Vancouver's downtown east side, one of the epicenters of the overdose crisis in our setting, and also, one of the poorest postal codes in Canada. And we specifically spoke to people who smoked instead of injecting. And the other one I just couldn't resist including was more broad BC-based study, talking to women who use drugs more generally and kind of comparing that with those who smoke or don't smoke, or who, are using poly modes of consumption. And I bring up both of these because the methods were fairly complementary and are from the same researchers. And mostly we coordinate with drug user unions and community groups to help recruit people into the studies. And the first study that was mixed gender also drew from two prospective cohorts that we have in Vancouver. So when people came in for that study, if they said they were also smoking their drugs, they were invited to join our study if they were interested. Obviously, people were compensated for their time. And also, I can't remember if I said this, but really these studies around smoking came out of requests from the community who were noticing that there wasn't a lot of data about it, even though most of them were smoking right now and kind of wondering about the overdose potential and things like that. So these were generated from those discussions. Let's see, where am I? Okay. So we don't know all the reasons, there's complex reasons why people might shift from injecting to smoking or to doing both. But there's obviously some themes that seem to emerge from the data. And there's lots of different reasons that we're seeing across the United States and Canada. Read my notes here. Okay. So obviously, one of the major reasons that people articulated switching to smoking is to address overdose risk. So really dealing with thinking of ways that might better do that than injecting. We know from the data actually that is not necessarily protective in terms of overdose because overdoses related to smoking are so high now in BC, but this was still an impetus for people to switch. Many people felt like smoking meant the drugs hit your body a bit slower. So they could deal with such high potency of substances through smoking, maybe taking a smaller hit and then waiting to see how it was and then taking another. And other people felt like they had increased control. By smoking, they were able to use smaller amounts than what they might use when injecting in terms of how much they were putting into their pipe or into their needle, for example. And most of this is because of the very unpredictability of the drug supply in our setting. Even though most people talked about switching to smoking because of safety risks in order to address overdose risk, many also acknowledged, people are smart and they know that people are also overdosing from smoking drugs as well. So I don't want to make it sound like people were naive, but it was still considered a preventative measure to some degree. So, for example, one participant stated, when you look at the numbers of all the people that OD'd, I think it tells you a pretty good picture of what smoking does. Now, with the first mixed gender study, I'll just say that all of the participants had dealt with smoking-related overdoses. So half of the participants had overdosed themselves from smoking. About a quarter had dealt with friends or family who had overdosed from smoking. And about half had helped in the case of a smoking-related overdose. So, for example, providing naloxone or calling 911, those kind of things. When people did overdose from smoking drugs, I had a few ideas of why that might be. And one, of course, was because the drug supply is highly potent and in many cases, sometimes stronger than people had suspected. So, for example, one participant stated, I knew it was fentanyl, but it was just too strong in their case when they experienced overdose. There's also a rise in polysubstance use. So people who are doing both fentanyl and also crack, for example, or methamphetamine, and that has also resulted in some confusion, sometimes thinking you're buying fentanyl when actually it's crack cocaine and vice versa. So those kind of mistakes happening, and also cross-contamination in the drug supply. So for example, unintentionally consuming opioids while smoking and intending to smoke stimulants, or with pipe sharing, which we know stems from sociocultural and structural factors. And so sometimes not knowing that there might be some residue of fentanyl, for example, in a pipe when someone's more used to smoking stimulants, for example. And so in those cases, they're experiencing increased overdose risk. Another participant stated, a lot of times you can't tell if you're getting fentanyl. Like if you're just someone who smokes crack, that's why a lot of these deaths have happened, because some people never use down. So if you're not expecting to down being opioids, if you're not expecting to have those, of course, the high potency means that you're more at risk of overdose. Of course, there's other reasons for the transition from injecting to smoking. Vein damage is less of a risk. When smoking, it can reduce the risk of bloodborne or skin infections, and it's also related to what's available in the drug supply, and that can relate to formulation as well. So, powder heroin compared to black tar, those kind of reasons as well. This is a picture in Vancouver, BC, of a women and gender diverse outdoor overdose prevention site that enabled the smoking of drugs. It's those little white tents. It's kind of far away because it's gated off, basically in kind of like a parking lot. It was put up in 2020 to address both the higher smoking incidence among women and also dealing with COVID-19, having an outdoor space for people to consume their drugs under the supervision of someone who could support them if they overdosed. I just want to point out that you can see it's, severely under-resourced. It is really cold there. When it snowed or rained hard, the tent would fall down, and actually it doesn't exist anymore. It's been lost its funding. So we do have multiple overdose prevention sites across Vancouver and BC generally, but very limited access to ones that allow for smoking your drugs. And this picture is actually the inside of that smoking tent that I just showed you, just to get a better idea of what it was like within the actual setting. Women expressed a couple additional reasons for their transition to smoking or including smoking. So one is a response to addressing overdose risk, but also as a response to addressing gender-based violence, particularly sexual assault. So smoking was seen as more protective in that you might be less likely to lose consciousness, for example, if something like benzodiazepines or tranquilizers were also in the opioids that they might be using. And because right now in BC, benzodiazepines are so much in the drug supply, we are seeing a lot of rapid blackouts and a lot of sexual assault that is not reported in the way that overdose deaths are, of course. So it's kind of a silent violence that is happening in relation to this drug adulteration at the same time. Women also saw smoking as a way to address having a limited income because it's perceived as sometimes lasting longer than when you inject your drugs. For other women, it allowed for further autonomy. Women are more likely to require assistance injecting. And so with smoking, they didn't need to go out and get that assistance from someone who may expect something in exchange. And also, there was ideas around gendered beauty and body expectations. So smoking is less visible or noticeable on the body. It's not going to leave track marks or vein damage in the same way. And also because smoking is considered quite social, and a lot of women enjoyed sharing their drugs with one another. And so it was easier to share when smoking than injecting. As one participant stated, I have difficulty shooting sometimes. I have to go out to the alley to have someone shoot me up. So talking about the difficulties of requiring assistance injecting when smoking was much easier than in terms of having their own autonomy. Okay, so obviously if we had all the answers, we wouldn't be dealing with a toxic drug crisis and multiple deaths in our setting and across the United States and Canada. But there's some, straightforward things that could be supportive, expanding sanctioned spaces for polysubstance use and drug smoking, which we really don't have a lot of. I know that the community is working really hard in British Columbia and across Canada to increase the number of, for example, sites that allow for indoor smoking, but I know there's difficulties with the legislation around that and not a lot of public support, I would say as well. But that would be one obvious first step. Expanding advanced drug checking technologies. A lot of people are actually checking their drugs in Vancouver, and that does help people have a better idea, at least, of what they're about to take. And we don't have a lot of drug checking in rural settings or anything like that. Widespread distribution of smoking-related harm reduction supplies. We have a pretty comprehensive program around things like needle provision in British Columbia, but there's a little bit less availability of sterile drug smoking equipment, things like heat and shadow resistant glass, crack, and methamphetamine pipes, vinyl tubing, brass screens, etc. And foils are still somewhat restricted. They're available in some settings. Access to smokable prescribed alternatives to the unpredictable drug supply. Now, we do have a small amount of people in British Columbia do have access to pharmaceutical grade alternatives to the unregulated drug supply, but it's very small and few are smokable. So most of them are like, I'd say, sorry, I'm losing my voice, tablet hydromorphine, the fentanyl patch, sublingual fentanyl, things like that. So we don't really, and we also, it's not allowed also in the settings where people might be getting their pharmaceutical grade alternatives. They're not able to smoke. So it does mean a lot of people who are at high overdose risk are not having their needs met. And of course, working with people who use drugs to shape policy, share expertise, disseminate accurate knowledge around smoking related overdose, and also, of course, legalization offers options as well. I can really see that things like thinking about opium gum, I know that the more alternatives or options that people have for how they consume their drugs and what drugs they might take are really useful because people respond differently to different things. So having something like, availability of opium gum, being able to smoke, I think could work for some people who are at high overdose risk. Of course, it's not as strong as a drug supply right now, but that doesn't mean that people don't respond better to a variety of options. That's everything. Thank you. I'm going to stop
On the
sharing.
contrary, we appreciate both contributions. And now I'd like to ask if anyone has a question. I was writing down a few, although if somebody wants to contribute, share a story, or ask anything, please go ahead. No? Okay. I've been volunteering in a safe consumption site here in New York, in Manhattan, actually. Probably you've heard of it. The name is On Point. Have you? Because a question that I would like to ask, specifically for Benjamin, is the traditional versions of these places, which could be indoors, outdoors, but if we want to focus on users of opium gum, then we would have to consider outdoors, places where the users can use responsibly in an outdoor area. Although it's also possible to implement strategies that would allow the consumers to use indoors without putting at risk others, for example, by vaping, right? How can we transition from the raw opium gum that is smoked through pipes to a modern version that would fulfill the needs of the user, and at the same time, it won't disturb anyone around? Because that's the thing when we smoke indoors, right? That we're bothering the rest.
What an interesting question. I guess I would punt this a little bit to Jade, but I want to ask the question in a slightly different way, which is that when I think about, and I'm still putting it in scare quotes, but when I'm thinking about traditional consumption, I'm thinking of practices that are fundamentally social ones. And there is, of course, the image of the opium den, but I think a more there's a wider range of social circumstances where people would be consuming in South Asia, in Asia Minor, in many different contexts, and the what we s- what when I think of the pushing out of those spaces, I associate them with certain technological changes. So the shift from smoking to injection, from consumption and from smoking to injection is a really deleterious one. And so if we think about kind of reverse engineering backwards, I'm curious, and this is where I'm throwing it to Jade here, what those sites might look like that accounted for the different ways in which people use both for the um the somatic effect, but also the kind of the social function that they play. And of course this is a very live debate where I am in Boston too, where we have supervised consumption sites in at least one city, in Somerville, but not in Boston proper, though there's been a conversation around that. This
Which
comes at a
were
time
working
when
in a clandestine. Sorry that I'm
yeah, no,
interrupting.
please.
No, or were they legal
We
places where
have
people could be
there's a
using drugs?
pilot in Somerville. I don't know where that's gone. So that's and Somerville is a notably progressive city. So if it's going to happen anywhere, it would be there. This comes, by the way, at the same time that that Boston has moved from in a very clear way from we're opening the first social cannabis sites, and so there's the very clear kind of eagerness, with one set of substances and a lot of hand wringing over the other. So I'm batting this around a little bit, but I'd love to hear, Jade, how you parse that question about, moving things either in or out of public spaces, accounting for social uses. Tell me if that's a useful intervention. And I see maybe Sylvia might be raising
Yes,
a hand as well.
I'm sorry, I don't find the icon for raising my hand.
You're good, Sylvia.
Hello, thank you very much, Jade, for this very interesting speech. I've been a street worker for many, many years, and I'm a psychotherapist now in my old age, but I still support all these harm reduction projects, etc. We don't have consumption rooms in Vienna. It's very conservative because also they're always afraid of the right-wing parties and so on. But I was thinking because you mentioned, and you also, Jorge, this how is it possible to integrate smoking venues into normal drug centers, for example. And there is one example in Hamburg. It's for female drug users. I'm sorry, I forgot the name, but it's no problem to find it out. It's a female consumption room, and they can also stay there for a while. And it's right on the prostitution site also. So a lot of prostitutes use this. And I was thinking that sometimes it's easier to establish something for vulnerable folks that nobody is really afraid of, female users. It's a kind of a protection thing for them. And they have a kind of a capsule, a small compartment where where these women can also smoke their whatever mess or whatever they do. So this is a highly political thing, and I've paid my price in my lifetime, really. But we have to really try and look how they do it in other places. In Vienna, it's not possible, there is not even a normal consumption site. But in generally, sometimes this shift to go say, okay, we do it for the women, it causes less aversion. from some parties. It's just something that came into my mind. And I think it's also important because they take great risk. This one woman who said she has to go outside and ask if somebody can shoot her up. I remember in the 1900s, I don't know, when I was a young girl, I did the same thing. And it was highly risky. I didn't realize it at that point. But, so it's really important to get the women into these sites and to support them and so on. These are just my 5 cents for that. Thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately, we haven't advanced as much as we would like to in Austria. No, the cannabis industry hasn't proliferated yet on the legal scenario. But we keep trying. And that's the question that I was gonna ask, no? Like, how can we convince the like smoking rooms for cannabis to allow other types of drugs? Because they already have the expertise, right? The knowledge, the experience. They know how to handle these situations, and they can assist people who need an alternative.
Can I jump in?
Please do it.
Thanks. And thanks, Sylvia, for those great points. Well, we have cannabis is legalized in Canada, and so we don't really have, but it's illegal to smoke cigarettes or in public spaces and things like that, or inside. But we have vaping, of course, but cannabis isn't really much of a big deal here, so we don't really have indoor setting spots for it. And I do know, just from doing the research myself, in some of the outdoor overdose tents where smoking was allowed, that, I mean, obviously it hits you being around when people are smoking cannabis quite differently than when people are smoking things like methamphetamine. Just my own experience at those sites. But I do think when they're really low barrier, meaning you saw some of those under-resourced tents, that's very accessible to people at very high risk of overdose. And they did allow some socializing. I didn't show you, but there is like a sleeping pod in one of them that people could take a break. And but of course, not everybody wants to go to those, and not everyone is so structurally marginalized who use drugs. We have a whole range of people who do. So those aren't very useful for those people. In Vancouver, we do have an indoor overdose prevention site that allows for smoking, and it's sort of like a different room, one room where you can do injecting, and a different room where they have the safety regulations and the vents and everything to do that. And we also have one in Victoria. So there's one in each, which are different than just a tent hack that's put up. But I do think socializing is important, and certainly the kind of low barrier tents that we saw pop up enabled that, but less so when we're having a more medicalized setting. And we've also just switched in British Columbia. We had a little bit of a decriminalization project going on, but there's a lot of backlash from the conservative government, people like that. They were so concerned that people were using their drugs outside, smoking in public settings, that now we've gotten rid of decrim quite quickly. And we've also switched to forced witnessing. So people who are accessing alternatives to the toxic drug supply, who could maybe take those home and use them privately in their own setting, now have to be witnessed by a pharmacist or a doctor, for example. So it really does reduce, I guess, the range of options available for consumption.
And both options should be considered, from my opinion. From my perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Because of all the deaths that continue to, proliferate.
Totally agree. What else do we have?
I'll just add that I've been to On Point in New York, and it is so much nicer than anything we have in British Columbia. It's like day and night. It had
Sam is doing an amazing work there.
Yeah, it like was really wonderful to get a tour and just to see how it addresses so much more than substance use. Obviously, we try to do that in Vancouver, connecting people to housing, social services, having, supplies like food and, safer sex supplies and stuff like that, but nothing like what we saw in New York that, had like a range of supports that we don't have. Really nice to
Yeah.
see.
And what I was going to mention too is how useful these sites may be to conduct research and also to provide supplies, right? Harm reduction services, like not only the space, the zone, the area where they can consume responsibly and reducing their risks, but using all the available tools that they need. And those tools become available because there is a space, an area where they can gather and reunite. So we can deliver the services in a certain local shop.
Could I ask folks, because we have people in this conversation from US, from Canada, from Austria with experience in the German context. I'm curious about, just with the time that we have left, about what folks have seen about, at least, I think about the changing political context here, where there is at once a kind of conversation in at least American cities about, I'm putting it also in scare quotes, about disorder and kind of the optics and aesthetics of public use. And one would think, or one could think, that that would translate into greater support for supervised consumption spaces, for different modalities. But it doesn't seem like it's kind of, at least here, and I'm thinking very locally about even the neighborhood that I live in, it doesn't feel like it's translated that readily into a different kind of policy push. And I can think of some of the 30,000 feet macro level questions of why that is, but I'm curious what folks' experience of changing political climates at this moment has been, but also what strategies are there for, I don't know if it's capitalizing on the current moment or meeting the current moment, but translating that into something that is not fully regressive and taking us back a long way. It's an open-ended question, but it sounds like folks in this room have a lot of experience with this.
Something that I also wanted to ask is the adulteration issue. Have we seen that in previous years, or it's a modern challenge?
The question of supply, adulterated supply.
Yeah, because consuming opium in its raw form, it is a way, an opportunity to reduce the risks that adulteration poses
Yeah, the only
powder
people,
form.
historically, the only folks who ever got raw opium gum were the people who were, producing it in the fields. From the 18th century onwards, anyone who had access to opium gum was always worried about it being adulterated with wax or with, I have all these lists, or coal, or a million different things. I think the difference is probably the toxicity, is that was a question about, purity of the pharmaceutical product and its efficacy versus, I don't think, there was no particular question of, fatality with those. So yes, it's a weird, that's the adulteration always, but what we've seen in the last, I know, call it, however many years is at a very different quality.
Just a remark on development, also historical. We had our high times in the 80s and 90s concerning support of drug users and in the implementation of services. Now everything has been cut down a third. So everyone is in Austria. We must be aware that we don't turn Hungarian like things are developing. But the only space where things are still expanding is University Clinic of Psychiatry. There I have projects with ketamine, with psilocybin, and this just trying out several substances. And so I think this is a way of letting there are good people in psychiatry here too, young people that are trying out all kinds of things. For example, also laughing gas, which is extremely effective. I can only recommend it. I go half a year, I go to my dentist, and it's totally relaxing. For some people, it's a good form when they're in a treatment for psychiatric disorders. There are a lot of studies going on in Europe, but also in America, in the US America. So I think this is something we have to rely on, because the communities don't have the money anymore, and it needs to be funded, these kind of projects. And the other stuff is, I don't know, I can only see it from here. It's not possible to expand this low threshold stuff, at least at the time being. But I think we have to prepare everyone for times that are more scarce, and to find ways to reach folks with less money.
Yeah, I'd say absolutely. You know, in Vancouver, for example, the overdose deaths are really tied to broader social structural factors like, you know, poverty. We have a lack of housing here. People who are homeless are less likely to use some of the health services, so not being connected to health services, and all those intersecting factors. If we had a basic income, I think those supports would be protective even while we're dealing with the substances. But, you know, initially when we had you know, a move away from natural sources of drugs, the idea was that they couldn't be measured in such a precise scientific way to some degree, along with other like racialized discourses that drove that and things that Ben spoke about in his talk. But now we can see very much that you know, synthetic and semi-synthetic drugs, which are adulterated in our supply, still aren't necessarily working either. And so I think there's, you know, it's a point in time where we might need to open up our ideas of what would, you know, the varieties of what might suit people, like you're talking about, Sylvia.
Sylvia, is there another question? Does anybody else want to do a question? Wants to do a question? Does anybody else want to do a question? No? Great. How much time do we have left? Let's see it's 5:30 in Europe, 12:30 here. We're pretty much done with the side event. Thank you very much. And hope we're gonna upload the video and with a paragraph explaining the side event, the objectives, what we achieved, the findings that we.
Where can I find it, the video, the recording?
It's gonna be in the website.
On the website of your organization?
Yeah, I can copy paste the link here.
Please do so.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thanks for including me.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's great to chat to all of you.
Have a nice evening.
Bye, folks.
Bye.
Where is it?
I'm about to do it.
Yeah.
Give me a second. It's great to know that you're based in, you said Vienna?
Yeah.
And how did you find out about the side event?
I was in the Vienna NGO committee for a long time for the International Federation of Social Workers. And we did a
I also
side
studied
event 2
social
years
work.
ago ourselves with it was about hydromorphine, which
Yeah.
is administered in a drug on-site center here.
Mhm.
It's all scientific. Without science, nothing is working here anymore.
Yeah, the work that the BNGOC does is fantastic, no? To unlock partnerships, collaborations.
Yeah.
Here we have
Did you
it.
put it? Did you put it? I don't see it in the chat. Here we go. Agora Lab. Okay, wonderful. That's great.
And so you're still collaborating with the International Federation of Social Workers, right?
No,
Not anymore.
because they don't want anyone to be in the Vienna NGO anymore. They kind of reduced everything.
They don't belong to the VNGOC?
What?
The International Federation of Social Workers is not part of the
No, they're
coalition?
interested in other stuff. They don't want to do anything with drugs anymore. This is my
And they were addressing the topic
So I'm
earlier.
just representing the Association of Austrian professionals in the field of drugs, which is an Austrian-based organization.
Professionals in general, or social workers
No, in the field of
specifically?
drugs. In the field of drugs.
In the field of drugs.
Yeah, everyone who's working as a professional there.
Mm.
And your organization, Agora Lab, what is it?
Yeah, so we have been implementing initiatives to promote public policies.
Drug policy. Mm-hmm.
We're trying to convince decision makers about the impact that regulating drugs, decriminalizing too. We also favor those. The historian was saying quasi-medical formats, no? But it's like we have to innovate to know what initiatives, laws may be useful to consider to address the needs of the users. In the case of Portugal, for example, they decided that the best model is the decriminalization, and it's a beginning, no, a route that we can consider to continue improving the proposals that we do.
So your organization is Portuguese?
It's not. No, I was putting that example because it's a country that we have focused on.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
But no, the organization was born in Mexico, and we now have representation in different countries.
Okay.
Sebastian just left, I think. He's in Bogota, you know.
So it's all Latin and Latin network, more or less.
Kinda, yeah.
Yeah, language is important, in these kind of things.
Totally.
How long do you think it will take until the video is? Because I would like to send it to somebody who's an important guy in Austria. How long will it take? How many weeks or so?
To be in the website? Hopefully by tomorrow.
Okay. So that's very good. Yeah.
It won't take long.
I was very tired today because I'm not really healthy, and I thought, okay, this is the only thing that is interesting me. And it was really fascinating. It was really vitalizing.
Thanks for asking. It's like that's definitely what we wanted, no? Participation from the participants.
Yeah, if you're interested, I could also send you the link that we did the video we did 2 years ago for the IFSW, but it was also supported by all kind of other organizations about the Hydromorph project.
That was interesting for me too.
Yeah, and it was the leader of this organization. He died some days afterwards. So it was his swan song, his last. But for me, it was very important to organize this and give him this platform. So I would send it to, where should I send it to you? Agora Lab or? Do you
Yeah,
have it?
below in the website, there's
Yeah.
the address.
Okay, of the organization.
Correct. I
Jorge
can also put it here.
Valde Rabbano.
That's my name.
I will send it to you and also to Jade Boyd. Yeah, because I think this is important. Models of good practice,
Yeah,
and it's still going on. They did not cut it, and
yeah.
people really went away from using
Tell me.
street heroin to this hydromorphine because they said they liked it better. It was cleaner and they
The
liked
users wanted
the users
that.
the
They
users like it.
asked for those
People
substances.
know what is good for them usually, they if you give them something that is clean and better and for free, they will
Yes.
usually choose it. Yeah.
Mhm. Good. Yeah,
Good.
and I've been working with, I don't know if you know this organization based in Colorado, so probably no, because it's an American institution. Psychedelics Science is the name. They
Psychedelic science.
have a partnership, with the National Federation of Social Workers, I believe.
Interesting. This is a topic I'm really interested in.
Yes.
This is, at least since I read this is Your Life on, no, what is it about plants by this guy. Anyway, all
I don't know.
these kinds of plants. Yeah, I think they have a great potential also
Okay.
if it's syntheticized, a great potential for healing, or at least
A
to
great
reduce
potential for healing.
the stress.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No,
This is Your Mind on Plants.
Of course,
yeah.
Okay.
Do you know the book?
By Michael Pollan, yeah.
Yes. I love it. Yeah. He's a great guy.
Yeah, he already has a documentary, no? Netflix.
He what? Huh?
I think they published his book in a movie, in a documentary format.
This could be, yeah. And this is what also interests me because, all these programs that they have now running at the university clinic.
Yes.
And also in other European, Charité in Berlin, for example.
In Berlin.
It's all the money, all comes from
Germany,
funding.
right?
And it's about depression, non-treatable otherwise. And this is where they started. And then they expanded the project more and more for people who are bipolar, because they have a high suicidal risk. And ketamine is anti-suicidal.
And is it allowed in Austria?
Yes, it's university clinic. They can do what they want.
Only for research.
Yeah, it's for, but the woman.
Because in New York it's legal. We have clinics.
Yeah. It wasn't some years ago that it was just the university side. And then the woman who organized this, Lucy Bartova, she's a great lady. And
I'll look her up.
And she established it. She made further education for doctors. And now it is paid by Social Security even. So you can also go to a private doctor. I mean, you still have to pay in most of the cases, but they don't do it only in the hospitals. Before it was only in the hospital and people liked it. And then they came out of the hospital and nobody could prolong it. And so it kind of, she really looked after her clients and what can she do for them? And I think this is really interesting, the outcome, what it does for psychiatric disorders, because all our clients have some kind of disturbances, and it's about fear, anxiety, it's depression, it's PTSD. They also do it for PTSD in the university clinic with the ketamine. I hope that they kind of expand it more in terms of substances they use, and not only stick with ketamine or psilocybin.
Kratom, for example, is another alternative.
Kratom?
Yeah, for depression specifically. It's a booster, no?
How do
It's
you write? How do you write
similar
it?
to cannabis, no? Marijuana, but it also has its side effects, no? And kratom doesn't because it's a stimulant.
Kratom.
Yeah,
Yeah,
kratom
yeah, yeah,
in
yeah. Yeah, it's a little,
in
yeah.
Europe English.
Yeah, there are stuff I would not touch. I would never touch ayahuasca. This is too
Why
wild.
not?
No, too wild
It's
for me.
not.
No,
No,
it's too
try
wild.
it.
No. I'm a very anxious
Go to
person.
the
And
Amazonian forest.
I'm more on the how do you say, calming effect. Yeah. So I think maybe psilocybin, but anyway. But laughing
And
gas
here it's legal. We're
is a
not
nice
not
is a
here,
nice.
not in New
What?
York, for
Huh?
example.
What?
I think the only country in the world that has allowed psilocybin, is Australia, you know,
Yes, but I think there's another in
and in the
Switzerland.
US.
In Switzerland, but
Mhm.
also only
But
for
maybe,
doctors, only for medical use,
mhm.
and only for studies.
Yes, for
But it's something,
research,
yeah, it's all for
not
research.
even for medical use.
Not, I don't think so. Yeah, I'm not sure. I think
In
there are
Switzerland,
doctors who do
probably
it.
not.
I think there are doctors who do this, but they don't shout it out loud. But in
Mhm.
Australia, it's legal, you said, psilocybin.
And MDMA too.
You're sure?
I think so. Yeah.
I'm not sure about the MDMA. Yeah.
I definitely know that.
Yeah. Anyway, this is
What I don't know is the psilocybin part.
yeah, this is the way to start stuff in scientifical in research.
Yes, both. Change to
Then yeah, but you know,
classification. I'm reading here the news.
it's step by step, and you have to start on a very serious accepted way, and parallel clients are doing their things anyway, and after
Correct.
a while these two can come together, and it takes terribly long. A lifetime is not enough.
Although we'll keep trying until it happens.
We'll keep trying. Yes, we'll keep trying. Okay,
We
thank
don't
you very
mind.
much. This was a lovely meeting.
Same here. Take care, Sylvia.
Bye-bye.